Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we've been looking at is The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. And this is an ambitious, original, scholarly and wildly expansive book, dense and challenging in its science and scientific findings, but equally expansive and rich in explanation and reach, and whose ideas I'm going to set out in 3 films, which I've called firstly Science, secondly Philosophy, and thirdly History and Culture. And this is the first of these films, Science, and I'm going to set out the ideas of this film in 5 sections, which I've called Positioning and Presenting McGilchrist, Why the 2 hemispheres mean 2 worlds, Profiling the Hemispheres, Why right is master and left its emissary, and finally the rise of the left hemisphere and its consequences. So, kicking off with the first of these, positioning and presenting McGilchrist. And I think this is important because to understand McGilchrist, we need to be clear where he's coming from intellectually, because the argument that he makes and the way that he makes it is an unusual one. And that's both because of the nature of what he seeks to understand and the particular intellectual disposition that he brings to it. And in terms of what he wants to understand, which of course is the brain and its 2 hemispheres, this may be seen as a material phenomenon open to objective and scientific inquiry, but it's also a phenomenon which generates subjective experience, which must not only be part of the explanation, but is for McGilchrist at the very centre of his argument. And he comes to this complex problem of an objective brain generating subjective experience as a polymath, a scientist, and as a philosopher. As a polymath, his intellectual trajectory began in the arts, studying and then teaching English at Oxford, only later to train in medicine and become a psychiatrist. And in doing so, he spans the arts and the sciences, achieving success and recognition in both, with numerous fellowships, including amongst others the Royal College of Physicians and All Souls, Oxford. As a scientist, and very much like the subject of one of my earlier films, Rupert Sheldrake, he's an unusual scientist, alive to the power of science, but also to its limitations as an instrument for human understanding. And like Sheldrake, he grounds his work in science while simultaneously critiquing its limits, describing it as just one particular way of looking at things which privileges detachment. And in many ways, his concern is to do the opposite, which is to say, to privilege engagement. And in this, he might also be seen as a phenomenologist who, like Edmund Husserl, seeks to understand consciousness and mental experience objectively, but from the first person, from, as it were, the inside out. What this means for reading The Master and His Emissary is that the writing and the argument doesn't always follow what some might see as scientific orthodoxy. He doesn't write in the passive voice, and he doesn't set out his science in the classic detached style. Rather, his voice and his agenda are there from the beginning and woven across the whole argument. And whilst it's crucial to say that everything is founded on not just science, but a prodigious and impressive range of science, it remains the case that from the off he has a clear position which I think has 3 distinct aims. Firstly, to overturn the myths and the simplicities of the pop psychology of the 1960s, which posited the left hemisphere as superior and the source of all human excellence, whilst designating the right as inferior. Secondly, he wants to replace what he sees as this naive and uninformed view with a science-based claim for the primacy of the right hemisphere as the source of everything that makes us human, whilst at the same time warning us of the lifeless world that the left hemisphere would produce if it's left unchecked and unbalanced in the shaping of us, and therefore in the shaping of the world that we bring into being. And thirdly and finally, to claim, as the book's subheading suggests, that this is actually what's been happening, that over the last 5 centuries there's been a power struggle between the hemispheres to shape our experience. The left is winning, and the consequences, McGilchrist tells us, will be disastrous. So McGilchrist comes to his science with a position, and in a way that breaks with orthodoxy. And in addition to this, and another way in which he departs from orthodox scientific argument is by what you might call his necessary anthropomorphism, or put more simply, his turning hemispheres into people. And although at one point he protests, I'm well aware that hemispheres are not people, he also writes of applying to the hemispheres a different model, not that of the machine, but of the person. And in discussing Richard Dawkins' selfish genes, he tells us even the best scientists cannot help anthropomorphizing. But Dawkins was right, since if we anthropomorphize genes, much as I have anthropomorphized the hemispheres, they do operate in a selfish fashion. And it seems to me that this anthropomorphism is inevitable and necessarily flows from the claim that the two hemispheres have their own distinct will, desires and values, which is to say, they have the core characteristics of human personality. Indeed, this is foundational to his whole argument. But what is perhaps more important is that his argument also flows naturally from the science. In this case, the work of Roger Sperry, whose 1960s groundbreaking and Nobel Prize-winning work provided the first scientific evidence for hemispheric difference, or what became known as brain lateralization, and who concluded that both hemispheres experience their own private sensations, precepts, thoughts and memories. As Sperry put it, if there are separate sensations, precepts, thoughts and memories, as well as separate ways of dealing with all of these, it would hardly be surprising if there were separate desires formed and separate wills to each hemisphere, and we know from the experience of split-brain subjects that that is indeed the case. So, in The Master and His Emissary, we have complex subject matter that requires a complex approach addressed by an unusual scientist, all of which poses challenges for the presentation of McGilchrist's work. And this is made all the more challenging by the size of the book and the volume of the science that it brings to bear. And of course, this is a book brimful of science. To adopt McGilchrist's voice, you could say that science is the book's undergrowth, and it's dense and rich, and it's the creative force behind everything that McGilchrist argues. And it does seem to establish very sure foundations for his argument. Indeed, it's the range and quality of the constellation of papers, findings and publications, and the meticulous setting out of these by McGilchrist that makes the book for many such a challenging read. So to deal with these difficulties of an anthropomorphic argument based on a huge amount of science, this film will endorse his anthropomorphism as founded on science, and it will also only set out the conclusions of that science and not its workings. And with these framings and caveats now in place, I'll move on to his argument, beginning with part 2, why two hemispheres mean two worlds. And here, a useful place to begin is the question, why does our brain even have two hemispheres? To which McGilchrist answers, because our survival requires it, or to be more specific, because our survival requires that we simultaneously hold two particular, and as it turns out, incompatible kinds of attention, generated and housed by two distinct autonomous hemispheres, largely kept apart and independent of each other. The first of these will become that of the left hemisphere, which generates a highly focused, narrow and precise attention, enabling us to eat, to hunt and to manipulate the world. The second will become that of the right hemisphere, which holds a vigilant, receptive and widely diffused attention, enabling us to guard against predators, but also in a higher and larger sense that McGilchrist considers critical to connect to life beyond our immediate needs and be part of something bigger. And both of these very different kinds of attention, one as narrow as possible, the other as wide as possible, are indispensable. And yet to engage both at the same time would be to subject our attention to a kind of civil war, with each hemisphere potentially neutralising the other. And this is the evolutionary problem to which hemispheres are the solution. And evolutionary speaking, enabling both to function simultaneously brings really great advantages, where the principle of opponent processes offer dual control and a much greater clout. So that in McGilchrist's words, asymmetry pays. But to successfully work, crucially, each hemisphere must be able to operate independently, and this is achieved through a process of mutual inhibition, where each hemisphere resists but does not negate the other, allowing us both a necessary distance from the raw material of the world itself, and as well as a necessary distance between each hemisphere so we can properly function. And integral to this is the corpus callosum, the dense and thick neural tissue made from millions of fibres, which at one point McGilchrist refers to as the Berlin Wall, because although physically it connects the two hemispheres, operationally 98% of its neural fibres are working to inhibit, so that in McGilchrist's words, the primary effect of callosal transmission is to allow one hemisphere to inhibit the other, so that we have two hemispheres for two essential but incompatible tasks necessary for survival. But why does it follow that two hemispheres mean two worlds? And here McGilchrist gives at least three kinds of mutually supporting and interwoven arguments. Those concerned with the defining power of attention, those concerned with the defining power of values, and those concerned with the creative power of what might be called hemispheric personalities. And beginning with the first of these, the defining power of attention, and this for McGilchrist is of profound importance and foundational to his theory. And by far the most important difference he tells us between the hemispheres is the type of attention that they give to the world, arguing our attention not only changes the world but also changes us. Do we, for example, attend to a mountain as a prospector, a painter, a cartographer or a walker? All bring different kinds of attention, and with it different tones and textures to our idea of what a mountain is. And likewise, we give a different sort of attention to a dying man than we do to a sunset or a carburettor. And in these and many other examples, McGilchrist asserts the transformative power of attention. In terms of the defining power of values, he also argues that attention is a moral act, inescapably bound up with values, partly because the nature of the attention given alters what it attends to, which is to say, what it values, and partly because it brings a particular world into being, and with it, it brings its own set of values. Indeed, it is the values generated by the different kinds of attention brought to existence by the left and right hemispheres that has led not only to different worlds, but worlds which have been produced by different hemispheric personalities, which leads us to the creative power of hemispheric personality, which I'll now detail in part 3, profiling the hemispheres. And here I'll offer two kinds of profile, what might be called a technical one, setting out the distinct purpose and function of each hemisphere, and what might be called a profile of hemispheric personality, sketching their very different values and character, And given that McGilchrist aims to invert the current hierarchy which privileges the left hemisphere so that the right might be restored to its proper place as, in his words, the master, he sets out in meticulous detail the purpose, function, values and character of each hemisphere. And beginning with the left, and as already indicated, its purpose is to grasp and control the world so it might be manipulated and used in the service of survival. And it does this through a three-stage process of abstraction, division and reassembly. And beginning with abstraction, this is crucial to the left hemisphere, because in order to manipulate, we have to analyse, and to analyse, we have to find a way to fix and pin down nature as it flies, to step outside its flow and back from the immediacy of experience. And to do this, the left hemisphere must remove things from their context, extracting it from time to produce camera-like, a fixed, static, disembodied representation of the natural world, replacing the stream of time with an infinite series of photo-like static moments. And once this first stage of abstraction is achieved and the world is pinned into stillness, the second stage of division, which is really just the second stage of abstraction, can proceed, dismantling the now motionless still image of the world into an assemblage of parts in a process of isolation, classification, generalization and compartmentalization, turning the natural world into a mosaic of discrete entities, beginning with time and space and extending into the whole of life. And from here, the process of reducing nature so that it might be made useful is completed by a final stage, that of reconstruction and recombination, where the abstracted and now malleable parts are reassembled into a new virtual whole, which McGilchrist tells us is a theorized replica of selected reality, now fully subject to control, and whose component parts become exchangeable units in ever more elaborate systems of thought. And turning now to the right, which, unlike the left's intention to narrow and divide, is primarily concerned to bring the whole of being into existence, directly connecting us to the unmediated raw experience of the living world, with vigilant, exploratory and flexible attention held open across space and time and attuned to anything new, providing the necessary radar to survive predators and connecting the whole of us to the whole of nature. And unlike the staged processes and sequential logic of the left hemisphere, it does this by a series of simultaneous, interwoven and mutually dependent processes that McGilchrist identifies as pattern recognition, pragmatics and contextual understanding. And looking at the first of these, pattern recognition, instead of analysing dissected and static parts, it scans for patterns in the whole, taking the time necessary for something to emerge, and it often does all at once, as here the Dalmatian suddenly appears from the mass of dots and splashes, so that in attention and processing, the right hemisphere shuns finality and is always open to new possibilities, constantly searching for as yet unseen forms and configurations, and rapidly synthesizing multiple forms of information from multiple locations, exploring alternatives, and holding open multiple possibilities for understanding and action. And McGilchrist tells us that in order to manage these multiple processes and open possibilities, the right hemisphere has developed powers of pragmatic adaptation, which he calls pragmatics, allowing numerous procedures to generate a complex but coherent world of experience by the pragmatic and flexible use of the many forms of processing and possibilities and solutions. And of all the pragmatic arts, it's the capacity to understand understand context that is among the best of its qualities. And like the idea of attention, the concept of context is also foundational to McGilchrist's argument. And a good way to think about context is to use Rupert Sheldrake's idea of the field as the connecting fabric to all existence, or in McGilchrist's words, the things and relations that co-create the world. And just as musical notes mean nothing in themselves and only come to life in the context of a musical piece unfolding across time, and in the tensions between the notes that surround it, and between the notes and the silence, each note is both transformed and defined by context. And what is true for musical notes is also true for the whole of lived existence, residing as it does in a web of mutually conditioning and co-defining relationships. And if we're really to understand something, or to truly see it, context is for McGilchrist the often hidden, vibrating, oscillating and defining essence of any one thing, even if the context appears to be that of no context, which in McGilchrist's view is simply a thing ripped free of its moorings in the lived world. Even this merely creates a new context, this time a context of no context, or what might be seen as the selected exclusion of all that gives meaning and definition to living things. So that's the technical profile. And now turning to the profile of hemispheric personality, which of course is where what I've called McGilchrist's necessary anthropomorphism comes into play. And it's here that we begin to glimpse the first sense of what is at the root of his concerns, of what he sees as a hemispheric world out of balance and out of joint. A problem whose roots, he tells us, lies in the inexorable rise and power of the left hemisphere. And it's a problem he sees as flowing from deep in the personality of this widely perceived superior hemisphere, but one which for McGilchrist is beginning to threaten all that makes us human. And to establish this, he builds and extends on Sperry's original arguments for hemispheric personality, and it's to the left hemisphere that he gives most attention, producing three clusters of characterization. The first is that it is theoretical and self-serving, and this should be no surprise, as the world that the left hemisphere sees is a world built by itself. And as described earlier, this is a theorized replica of selected reality, which only pays attention to the virtual world it has itself created, generating knowledge within a closed system that McGilchrist likens to a hall of mirrors, and whose affinity for abstraction, McGilchrist claims, gives it an intuitive relationship between cutting things up and depriving them of life, coding for the non-living, and an affinity for what is mechanical, drawn to tools, machines, the fruits of human invention, the non-human world, and the emotionally neutral, all of which is paralleled by the fact that the only emotions under its control are anger and the superficial, willed and deliberate social emotions. And this affinity for what is mechanical can be found in many examples of people who have experienced right hemisphere injury, people who are now dependent on the left hemisphere to bring their world into being. And the relationship that they have to their bodies is to see them as machines made of parts. And McGilchrist cites numerous reports of body denial by patients, attributing, for example, their arm or hand as that of a child, the person in the next bed, or under alien control. And the theoretically constructed virtual world that it has created is built around itself. It is self-consistent, self-contained and self-interested, dealing only with what it knows and what it has itself made. Neurologically speaking, its pathways and synapses are more densely interconnected within itself, and it sees only what it brings into its super narrow focus, as famously shown in the experiment that many will know of the gorilla suit man in a basketball game. And this is only one of a number of its blind spots, and another can be found in a second cluster of arguments that point to its rule-bound and literal nature, where, for all its power and precision, beyond following rules and manipulating symbols, it doesn't really have an intuitive sense of what it's actually doing, partly because meaning is of little use in its quest for manipulation and control, and in its self-referential world, theory trumps experience, and truth is a matter of coherence between rules. And in a similar mechanistic fashion, and again illustrated in numerous experiments, a left hemisphere literalism in speech and thought has revealed itself in those who have experienced right hemisphere injury. But it's perhaps the third cluster, that it's certain, power-hungry and in denial, which perhaps is most important, where, and again this is detailed in numerous experiments, it needs certainty, is convinced of its own correctness, and seeks ever more power, turning mistaken conclusions into statements of fact, replacing gaps in its knowledge with fabricated explanations, confidently speaking despite its ignorance for the right hemisphere, and always looking to take full control of decision-making. All of which is compounded by self-denial. Indeed, McGilchrist suggests that denial is a left hemisphere speciality. Trapped as it is in its own positive feedback loop, it is ever optimistic and unrealistic about its shortcomings, willing to disregard even overwhelming evidence and blind to the lessons of experience. And it's through the very many ways that science can now observe the independent working of the hemispheres that we catch a glimpse of what the left hemisphere world would look like in such things as the dystopic half-world of hemi-neglect, where following a right hemisphere stroke, sufferers refuse to acknowledge a world beyond the self-referencing left hemisphere, which only concerns itself with the right side of the body and the right visual field, and therefore it ignores the entirety of life unfolding to their left, ignoring not only the left half of a clock face or newspaper, but equally oblivious to the presence of life at all, whilst in relation to themselves they may neglect to wash, shave, or dress the left half of their body, or again deny its existence. So this then is the personality of the left hemisphere, and ranged against this theoretical, self-referring, emotionally neutral, disembodied, rule-bound, certain and power-hungry hemisphere in self-denial, McGilchrist posits the right hemisphere as its mirror and opposite image, and again this might be loosely organised in three clusters of characterisations, the first of which I've called concern with life, emotionally rich and other focused. And if the left hemisphere is the hemisphere of lifeless and uniform abstraction, the right hemisphere is the hemisphere of the unique and living, dealing preferentially with living things in their embodied particularity, and which is intimately connected with the unconscious and the limbic system, making it better able to understand and express the full range of emotions and to give emotional value to what it sees. And what it sees is always the world beyond itself, from a relational disposition, which is the foundation both for its capacity for empathy and through empathy to moral sensibility. And in a second cluster of arguments, McGilchrist tells us it is also context-bound, open and networked beyond itself. Indeed, it's the appreciation of context that makes relationships and relations between things of primary importance, bringing into being not a world of rule-bound uniformity, but one located in what McGilchrist calls the betweenness of us as feeling beings and a natural world of complexity, particularity, changeability, impermanence and interconnectedness, where time, depth and bodies are just some of the defining elements of context, and where the kaleidoscope of nature is matched by its open concern for all that is irregular and new, and in yet another comparison, the self-contained inner connectivity of the left hemisphere contrasts with the right's capacity for the swift transfer of information across the whole brain, and even its capacity to use the preferred style of the left. And a third and final cluster of arguments define the right hemisphere as uncertain but realistic. And again, this should not be a surprise, as its openness to context, refusal to classify, welcome given to discrepancies, respect given to ambiguity, and its location in the flow of time determine it constitutionally incapable and uninterested in the pursuit of certainty. And for McGilchrist, this makes it less grandiose and more self-aware, placing it much closer to reality and more realistic about itself in its relationship to the world. And in all of this, we can already see why McGilchrist asserts the right to be the master and the left should be its emissary, in profiles that designate the left as enormously powerful but lacking self-knowledge, and the right as flexible, expansive, collaborative, realistic, pro-social, pro-life, and concerned with the whole of the living world and the whole of the brain, bringing us to part 4. Because despite all of these, what might be called reasons of character, McGilchrist offers still more arguments for what he calls the primacy of the right hemisphere. And of course, this is all part of his position and his agenda as the defender, the spokesperson, and the advocate of the right hemisphere after decades of what he describes as left hemisphere chauvinism, a conspiracy of silence, and a blindness among neuroscientists to its centrality and its contributions. And to these reasons of character already set out, he adds physiological and neurological arguments which have hitherto determined the right hemisphere as the master system in the development of our species. And physiologically speaking, McGilchrist tells us that feeling and emotion always comes before thinking, which is to say our judgments and choices begin in the body and therefore in the realm of the right hemisphere, so that in what is called the primacy of effect, we don't make decisions by thinking through options, we do so by intuition in a system where emotion and the body are at the irreducible core of our experience. So that at the heart of our being, he tells us, reason itself emanates from these central core of emotions, deep in the limbic system, which is to say, deep in the body. And what is true for reason is also true for speech, which only follows what McGilchrist calls a prior global synthetic image, not yet given linguistic structure. And neurologically speaking, it's also true that our experience of the world always begins in the right hemisphere. McGilchrist sometimes calls this its ontological supremacy, or put more simply, our sense of being begins in the right. At other times he calls it the hierarchy of attention, but however it's described, the point is that all new experience is first received in the right hemisphere, so that in the first instance it is the right which controls where our attention is oriented, and we always see things first as whole, whereby the right grounds our experience before it gets processed in the left, which only receives what has already been prioritised by the right. But it's perhaps the non-scientific observation that the right hemisphere is the source of everything that makes us human that recommends it as the profoundly unappreciated but ultimately most important of the hemispheres, a claim that McGilchrist founds not so much in reason and language, but in the right's claim to be the seat of imagination, creativity, capacity for religious awe, music, dance, poetry, art, the love of nature, a moral sense, a sense of humour, and the ability to change our mind, all of which McGilchrist asserts are now being threatened. Which brings us to the final section, part 5, the rise of the left hemisphere and its consequences for our world. And given all that's been said about the relative merits of the hemispheres, the obvious question is why nature and human evolution hasn't guaranteed this as the default of our species, To which the answer is it has, and for most of our history, and in an impressive way, it has produced the best of both hemispheric worlds. But for McGilchrist, this is precisely what is now being decisively undermined by a combination of hemispheric inequalities and recent cultural history, especially in the West. But for a very long time, balanced equilibrium was the natural default, where the process of bringing being into existence begins in the realm of the right hemisphere, which receives and brings the world into our experience, but which needs the left to process, unpack, unfold and refine that experience. And in the process of what might be called layered enhancement, the left's treatment of that experience works to enrich it and bring into being aspects previously not there. However, and crucially, despite this and despite its creative power, the left hemisphere must always be only the staging post and never the end point. And the process parts must return to be reintegrated into the whole of experience. As McGilchrist puts it, left hemisphere division and right hemisphere union need again to be unified in a new and higher synthesis. What had to be conscious for a while becomes unconscious again, and a lifeless representation becomes once more present and alive. And for McGilchrist, here is the best of all worlds, and it's worth saying that despite what seems to be his withering critique of the left hemisphere, he is very much at pains to stress he is neither anti-reason or seeking to encourage some kind of simplistic dichotomizing. Indeed, he's clear that for most of the time and over most functions, including language and reason, both hemispheres are at work, and he's also clear that without the distance and structure generated by the left hemisphere, there could be no art, only experience. Its contributions to language and systematic thought are invaluable. Our talent for division and seeing the parts are of staggering importance, and the gifts of the left hemisphere have helped us achieve nothing less than civilization itself. But all of this is predicated on a stable balance, a balance which works to transform opposed values and a potential power struggle between the hemispheres into a creative synthesis of good outcomes. But it's a balance which McGilchrist sees breaking down because, and in the first instance, of what he sees as three inequalities, or in his words, asymmetries, now being played out between the hemispheres. The first of these is the asymmetry of means, or put more simply, the left has all the instruments of power, where in what McGilchrist calls its triple armoury of language, logic and linearity, these together produce conscious discourse as its superpower, enabling it to articulate its worldview in language and certainty, and giving it the extraordinary advantage of being heard. The Berlusconi, or perhaps we should update it, the Putin of the brain, a political heavyweight who controls the media. And beyond this, and over time, it's also able to elaborate its own workings into systematic thought, giving it permanence and credibility, and against which the silent and the uncertain right hemisphere cannot compete. Next is the asymmetry of structure. And this inequality emerges because not only does the left hemisphere have the benefit of system building, but it has used this to produce a particularly powerful system, a system of self-enclosure, built in language and reason, which devalues and discounts what is not expressed in language or reached by reasoning. And between them, language and reason have been progressively closing the escape mechanisms from their virtual world, so that as its systems are established, they become reflectors in a hall of mirrors, which increasingly has us imprisoned and enmeshed in its lifeless world. And finally, there is the asymmetry of interaction, and this refers to the left hemisphere's ability to undermine the feedback mechanisms that thermostatic-like modify the brain systems to maintain its equilibrium, which of course most crucially means equilibrium between the hemispheres, which McGilchrist contends has now been undermined by the self-defining and the self-determining left hemisphere, whose armoury of language and logic and linearity has been mobilised to transform negative feedback loops into positive proof of its own invincibility. And using the philosopher Heidegger to illustrate what this might look like for us, Heidegger, through the pen of McGilchrist, tells us that we are caught up in a frenzy of reforming projects, enclosures, frameworks, division and structuring of ourselves and our environment, and turning all into a resource, nature turned into one gigantic filling station. And all of this, for McGilchrist, are the consequences of the left hemisphere entrenching its power and creating the world in its own image, arguing that over time the relentless growth of self-consciousness in both hemisphere and society has undermined the hemispheric balance of power and shifted our world ever further towards the part world created by the left hemisphere. In earlier times, its will to power was counterbalanced by forces outside of its closed and self-referential system, but under modernity, the routes of escape from the virtual world of the left hemisphere are being closed off. This, then, is the foundational argument for Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary. It's an argument he also makes with philosophy, which will be the topic of the next film. And it's also the groundwork for the second half of his book, where he tracks the advance and growing power of the left hemisphere through Western culture, through ancient Greece, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and all the way through to postmodernism. And that will be the subject of the final film. But for now, this concludes this first film on the Master and his Emissary, an expansive and potentially profound book that very much speaks to our times.